And we are live. It's Dr. J here in the house. Really excited. Today's topic is going to be all on mold, addressing it and testing it, seeing if you have toxic mold in your home. And we have the CEO and head of ImmunoLytics Lab, which is a cutting edge mold detection lab out of New Mexico. And JW is the founder here. We have JW. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dr. J. Good to be here.
Hey, same here. So let's dive in because I had personal mold issues in my house and I was able to reach out to you and you helped me. And then I was seeing a lot of patients over time that was having just a lot of mold symptoms. And it becomes difficult because one, how do you test it? Number two, how do you fix the root cause of the mold in the home? And typical mold remediation techniques have been just really, really expensive. And your lab and you kind of working with Jeff Bookout over at CitraSafe have really have really good testing that's really good entry level to assess what's going on, and then more techniques to remediate it in a more cost effective way. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, where do we start at, right? The best solution for everybody is to do everything, right? Have an environmental inspector come out, inspect the property, look for moisture, hidden mold, and collect a bunch of samples, air samples, swab samples, maybe an ERMI, but nobody can afford that, right? I mean, you get to $2,000-$3,000. So what's the best alternative that people can afford? And that's kind of where we try and come in. So we use the gravity plates, which is just a 1-hour settling plate to collect air samples throughout the house. And, they run around $33 a piece. So you can test numerous areas of your home, get kind of a statistical analysis of your home, a good representation of all the rooms, and then use those same plates to do tap testing, where you're testing fabric material, whether clothing or furniture or carpeting, to really try and help you identify, is there a problem? And if so, what are the potential sources?
What was that last test you said outside of the plates for the clothes?
The tap testing with the plates.
What's that? Oh, yeah. How does that work?
Real simple. You put a plate in the palm of your hand and you tap test an item 4 times. And so any of those mold spores will fly onto the plate, and then we can see if that's potentially affecting your health. So
that's great.
Yeah. You got that favorite chair you sit in every night and you're like, you know what? I just don't quite feel well, or I feel real tired when I sit in it. You can test that chair, see what's in it.
Oh, that's great. And how does, what's the price of the ERMI testing?
ERMI typically runs $125 to $175, depending on the lab you're using. Some go as high as $225 per test. So you're looking at one sample for anywhere between, say, $150 and $225.
Because I did some generalized air sample testing in my house when I knew I had visible mold. We talked about it was right there. It was some kind of a greener mold, I think an Aspergillus family, and we sent the swab right to your lab, and you guys picked it up. But the air testing didn't come back elevated at all. And then after we actually remediated and we did air samples again, it actually came back a slight bit higher, but it was still negative anyway. So that always perplexed me. But we did the plate testing to start, and in the room of the house where the mold was visible, it was off the charts high. It was like, I think in your lab, it's greater than 5 is considered to be a elevation in mold. And we were, I think, 18 or 19, and it was definitely more of the water-based mold. And so on remediation, and we retested, it was basically down to 1 to 0 across the home. So the plates seemed to detect it, where some of the air testing, and it was more of the conventional remediation company-based air testing, probably not the ERMI, where you kind of get the vacuum thing and you can kind of go around, but that didn't even pick it up. Can you talk about some of the shortcomings in the conventional mold testing?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's talk about mold first and kind of what it does, right? So some mold grows these little hyphal fragments out of the material, and then it develops spores. And those spores are just like seeds from a tree, and they travel just like dust. And so as the mold, especially when it dries out, then those seeds or spores are easily transported through the air, just like dust is. So they're going to go into the air like dust, and they're going to fall out of the air like dust. And the rate at which they fall is dependent on the size of the mold, the density of the mold. And there's some real great research that shows the settling times of mold, but something real small like an Aspergillus penicillium spore, it'll stay in the air for about an hour. Stachybotrys alternaria may fall out in just a few minutes. And so you have this scenario where you have hidden mold growing in walls. That mold is then going to enter into your breathable air, presumably through electrical outlets, light switches, recessed lighting, any holes between the drywall, the cavity, the wall space or ceiling space, and the breathable air. So you have to kind of picture this and what's occurring. And of course, as the house heats and cools throughout the day, you have kind of a billows effect where part of the house is heated and then that air expands and blows into the breathable air. And at night it cools and it's kind of sucked back in. So this is the way that the mold is kind of transported around, and you're going to get exposed to it. And then of course there's the mechanical dispersion of the mold, whether it's like a wall is hit or carpet is walked on, and those spores are then distributed back through the air. So with all that being said, we look at testing, we say, okay, well, the primary route of exposure for mold is going to be inhalation. You're going to breathe it. And so what is it you're breathing, and what could you be breathing? The gravity plates are a 1 hour snapshot in time of the air that you're breathing, but we also sell the swabs where if you have anything that's visible that you think may be mold, you just swab it with something like a Q-tip, and we analyze that and see what it is. Any visible mold would have to be removed, and is an indication of some type of water damage or water leak. And then the settling plate shows the route of exposure. When you get something like an ERMI, what you're doing is you're collecting a dust sample, as much dust as possible, and hoping that dust, it kind of represents what you're potentially breathing. Of course, if you sample on the floor, you have contamination from outdoor sources. If you walk through your garden, did some composting, your dog walked in, so they can bias the results that way. Best would be to take a dust sample a little higher up. I find ERMIs are kind of prone to false positives. What I really like about ERMI is it picks up the Stachybotrys pretty well. It's just, it's another
good. The black mold.
Yeah, it's another tool, right? Each of these sampling methods is a tool to try and address what may be a mold problem.
Where's the best place to get the ERMI test done?
Oh, well, I think we have some of our favorite labs. The one everybody seems to use right now is Micrometrics, because that's kind of the shoemaker lab.
Got it.
EM Lab P&K, I believe we've used a lot. And oh man, so you're putting me on the spot. I can't remember all the labs, but those are two right there that are good labs.
And are you guys going to start covering or start doing the ERMI testing at all yourself too?
No way. Yeah, I talked with Steve Jasper, who developed the ERMI. Oh man, this was right after it came out, 15 to 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And I just realized that the assumptions that were made in the ERMI analysis and interpretation just are completely flawed. And so no, the ERMI is not of interest to me. We might eventually do some type of qPCR analysis where you're looking at DNA-based analysis, but I can't really find a good application. If you look at ERMI, they analyze, I think it's 36 species, right? Well, if you look at us, if it lands on a plate, it grows, we detect it. So we look at about 50 genera, which represents like 35,000 species. So, it's kind of like the keep it simple, stupid, right? If it grows,
it's cost effective, you can test different areas.
It is. And I mean, I don't want to go into all the specifics with ERMI, but let me just give you one. Okay. If you look at ERMI, there's group 1 and group 2 molds. Group 2 is what you subtract out of group 1 to get your score. Group 2 has Alternaria in there, but Alternaria is the most antigenistic mold that produces some really nasty toxins. So it's pretty important to know if you have Alternaria. Some of the sickest people we see are exposed to Alternaria, and yet that's something ERMI says is not a problem.
Okay.
So that's why a lot of doctors have developed their own interpretation, is to try and get away from some of these issues.
Very interesting. And how does mold get on the plate? Because my concern is if mold's already kind of rested on the ground and we put the plate on the countertop or on the ground, how does the mold get in there so we can test it, assess it?
Yeah, it's settling out. So just as dust, if you stare at the light shining into your house and you see the dust traveling, it travels generally downward, right? And so it's just a general trend to settle out. So in a 1 hour exposure, the doctors we've worked with over the last 30 years have developed this health scale that says that if you're less than 5 colonies per 1 hour gravity plate, your health is probably going to be pretty good. It's not going to be affected by the environment. You notice that's not based on the type of mold, because we don't know synergies between mold. I mean, is Aspergillus and Penicillium together? Is that worse than Alternaria and Bipolaris together? We don't really know these things. So we do look at the genera, because there is some significance there. Of course, Stachybotrys is much worse than Cladosporum as far as health goes. So there is significance, but we do also base the potential mold loading on the total counts.
Very good. So we talked about some different techniques. You can do the tapping technique where if you have a close item, you can tap it 4 times the plate against the close. Is there a technique with putting the plate down? Should you kind of agitate that area through just walking through it and then putting the plate down? That way there's a greater chance that anything that was there will now make its way on the plate?
Sure. And what you're talking about, you're getting pretty sophisticated here, which is wonderful, because what we want to do, and we're actually doing right now, is developing educational materials to teach people how to do this as cheap as possible. So we're selling these $3 plates. You can just take and use them as a tap test or an air test, grow them in your cabinet, look at them and kind of be educated enough to know, yeah, I'm still good, or maybe I should send this into the lab. So what you're talking about there is kind of an aggressive sample is what we would call it in the industry. And that's where you're stirring things up to see what falls on the plate. That can be beneficial, but what we really want to do primarily is see what you're going to be exposed to day to day. So if you're normally running the HVAC system, run that. If you're normally walking around in the house, do that. Preferably turn off any air purification, because we don't want to get a sample that's biased a little low. We want to kind of see what's truly in the environment. So, those things come into consideration. It's the same thought on, should I test my attic or crawl space? Attics and crawl spaces are always nasty. If you're storing materials up there, or if you're looking for a source of the mold, then sure, test them. Otherwise, let's see first of all what you're being exposed to.
Very good. Very interesting. Let's kind of just do a mold 101 for a lot of people listening. Some probably maybe have no mold issues at all, or maybe they have health symptoms that are connected to it. Who knows? Mold is so many different symptoms connected to it if there's a toxicity in your body. So why is mold a problem? I mean, if I'm outside and there's, leaves that are just naturally breaking down, why aren't I getting sick there? But mold in the house is a bigger problem. Can you break that down?
Sure. And quite honestly, there's a little bit of a fallacy there in that some people think, well, I can't get sick from mold outside. I know that my wife and daughter, when they were severely affected by mold, my wife couldn't run her compost heap anymore because she would get sick even from doing that. And for a while, she couldn't even garden. So she was so sensitive to the mold that just a little bit would set her off. Now, why is mold indoors typically worse than outdoors? Well, it's because we seal up this toxic box, right? So basically what you've done is create an incubator. You've got completely closed in-house, so it's wonderfully energy efficient. There's no communication of inside and outside air, no dilution of toxins. Mold spores are ubiquitous. They're absolutely everywhere. And so we build our houses out of mold candy, which would be paper backing on drywall. It's paper backing on insulation. Mold it's candy. Wood members. Yeah. And so the only thing missing is water, and that's why I always say, one of my little catchphrases is no water, no mold. If you can keep the water out, you keep the mold out. And when I say keep the water out, that means humidity less than 60% and no standing water. Mold grows preferentially based on the amount of water activity. So keeping that water low keeps the mold low.
Very good. We're going to go into that in a minute, because I have so many patients that are like, hey, I've never had a water leak. It's like, yeah, but you got 65% humidity in your basement. And that's going to be an incubator for mold, and that will eventually work its way through the house, where you have not necessarily an attic leak or a leak in the drywall. You have high humidity, which is creating an incubation for mold. That happens a lot, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. If there were no known water events within a house and the house had a basement, you're just about guaranteed the basement's going to be the highest levels in the house. And that's because it's subgrade and you've always got some water up against those walls, external walls. And so there is some type of humidity condition that will lead to mold growth. And
so why is that? Just because the cement foundation's kind of creating a heat sink between the wet environment on the ground on the outside, and there's some kind of moisture transmitted through that? Is that what's happening?
Cement's like a sponge. Most people think of it as a hard surface. The water goes right through it. It may not even appear wet, but it's producing humidity inside. To give you an example, I had this beautiful house here in Corrales, New Mexico. I really liked it. Flat roof house. It had lots of mistakes, but it had this koi pond in the front. And the dang pond, I had to put like 100 gallons of water a week in it because it was leaking, and I didn't have time to fix it because it had koi in it. Well, all that water was going underneath my foundation, and I had no water leaks at all, but very high humidity. I mean, it was running 65, 70% in the desert. And it was from this pond in this water underneath the foundation. This was early on. I'm hopefully a lot smarter now.
Yeah.
But I didn't really pick it up until a little later what the cause was.
Wow. Unbelievable. Yeah. So we have the humidity kind of factor. So we have to look at humidity. So we should get some kind of a humidity meter, whether it's attached to your thermostat or individual detecting device. Now, I spoke with you earlier. Maybe you changed your assessment. I think last time we chatted, you said you wanted it like 50% or less. Now you said 60. So is 60 the better gauge, or?
60 is the drop dead cutoff. 50 is like a target. Yeah. I really prefer 35 to 40%. 50, I'm starting to go, okay. See, the problem is if you're at 50 on average, you could have isolated pockets in your house of 60, right? So you're just doing the best you can to keep that humidity low.
Now, after we spoke, I purchased a whole house dehumidifier. I got one of the April Air versions that covers 5,000 square feet. And I have that for the most part attached to my basement. So my basement, I keep at about 48% all the time. that works great. And then during the summer months, when the air conditioner's on, that has a natural dehumidifying effect. So for the most part, we're good. And then in the off season, I have Nest thermostats that monitor the humidity. So I'm always keeping it below 50%. Do you think that's a pretty good gauge for most people to achieve?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, that's a good setup. Yeah, down here we don't have as much of a problem with humidity, but especially, like Kentucky, we know a certain person there that has to wrestle with that. And so, the natural thinking is, well, dilution is the solution to pollution. So, yeah, bring in that outside air. But a certain person brought in so much outside air that their HVAC system was dripping water. And so you have to kind of manage this and be responsible with bringing in the fresh air, dehumidifying, and not creating mold problems by doing those two things.
Exactly. I could tell you in my basement, which is 2,000 square feet, it had about a 68% humidity. So now I keep the April air on and I just have it set to about 49%. And it does really well. This time of year, the humidity naturally drops where we actually have to put a humidifier on because the humidity gets to about 15% where it's just so bloody dry. So we'll bring it up to about 30 in the winter, which is still very dry, which, you would think there's not going to be any chance of mold growth with that, correct?
No, there shouldn't be.
Yeah. Exactly.
Anytime somebody says they're using a humidifier, that's always a bit of a concern because you got to keep those things clean. You got to make sure you don't have those isolated pockets of humidity. But certainly I understand comfort wanting the humidity a little higher.
Yeah, exactly. Ours is connected to the HVAC, but we try to have it serviced at least once a year to check it. I use the April Air brand for the humidifier and for the dehumidifier. Any feedback on brands?
Nope. I always just look at reviews and determine that way. I don't keep them in my head.
Perfect. All right. So we have that kind of obvious thing, which is going to be the humidity. So $10 humidity detector, that's going to be the best way to assess that. Now, what about more overt things like leak in the roof, leak in the drywall? What's the best way to assess this? Do you recommend moisture meters? How do you attack it outside of like, hey, the drywall is wet. Hey, there's a water stain on the ceiling. How do you assess that?
Yeah. And that's the tough part. So we want to try and educate people to just keep their eyes out, right? So the first is, if there's any water at all within a home, it needs to be dry within 48 hours. 48 hours is your absolute cutoff before mold's going to start to grow. So if you see a problem, don't say, oh, I'm just going to wait and I'm just going to address it later. It needs to be dried quickly. So you want to use fans, dehumidifiers, and get that dried. If it's been longer than 48 hours, you have to be careful with fans because you can spread mold spores all around. But certainly drying is the key. Me personally, just one of the tips I like is every 12 to 18 months, I have my roofing contractor come out and inspect my roof. It's the most obvious source of potential water. And so we look at the roof often. And then, of course, you want to make sure you don't have flooding or any water up against external walls. The gutters are extended away from the foundation. Just think about keeping water off of your house. That's the key. Don't let landscaping slant towards the house. Just consider water has to be away.
Yeah. One of the big things I did that made a big difference is once we chatted, I think January, February this year, I am proactively hiring a roof guy to go up my roof, give him a couple $100, go in there, check out all the flashing, check out all the seams, make sure proactively there's no leaks. Best couple of $100 ever to spend. So 100% agree with that. I think everyone should be on top of that. Number two was we made sure our sub pumps were dialed in and they had individual battery power to it. So if there's ever an outage because of a flood, we have those sub pumps able to run on external battery sources. Any feedback on the sub pumps, which are basically a pump in between the concrete foundation and the ground to get that trapped water out? Any feedback on that?
You just got to keep it dry and monitor it. If I go and it looks like there's any growth in the sump pump, I might treat it, with peroxide, or some people can tolerate bleach. Of course, we don't like to promote bleach, but just something to kind of treat it and make sure if you've got a sump pump, then you got to also have a dehumidifier because it's going to be humid down there.
Yep. Everyone, in my opinion, who's got a crawl space or a basement, just invest the money to have a whole house dehumidifier. It's worth it. I know people that have regular, dehumidifiers that aren't connected to a drain. And I can tell you by the end of the day, there's a gallon or two already filled. And those things are naturally set to trigger. Once it gets full, it stops dehumidifying. So you got to be changing it at least once to twice a day in heavy humidity months. And most people can't keep up with that.
Sure. And of course, where you are, that's a real problem. Where we are here in the desert Southwest, we have crawl spaces and we don't need dehumidifiers. But since you brought up crawl spaces, I do want to talk about that briefly, is that there's two ways to handle a crawl space. You either make it immaculate or you make it into a wind tunnel. And those are the only two ways to handle it and have a healthy crawl space. So it has to be just as clean as and pristine as your indoor environment, or you have to have a crawl space fan and draw the air through there so that you essentially get a negative pressure in the crawl space. So you don't get that air communicating up in your breathable air. So those are the only two ways to keep crawl spaces healthy.
Very good. What kind of simple tools can people get at home to assess what's happening in their home? So we have like a humidity detector. That's a simple one, right? We know that. Anything 60 or up, we're really concerned. Are you concerned at 55%? Like, is that kind of still
you're talking statistics? Yeah, you're just talking statistics. If you're at 55, you might be at 60 somewhere, right? So it's just, don't play with fire. Keep it as low as you can.
And I'm not sure if we've kind of broken it down why humidity even matters. I'm going to go into my explanation and I'll give you a whack at it too. So basically, humidity is going to look at the saturation of water or moisture in the air. And the more saturated the air is, the harder it is for water in your house to evaporate. So like JW just said, after 48 hours, standing water is going to create mold. Why? Because it hasn't been evaporated. So the drier the air is, the greater chance that that air acts like a sponge and pulls that water up, therefore providing less chance for mold to grow. Is that a pretty good assessment?
That's pretty good. Let me throw this at you.
Yep.
Okay. So say you have dried fruit, right?
Yep.
Dried fruit doesn't grow mold, keep it on the shelf forever. If you have fresh fruit on the shelf, a week, 2 weeks, it's starting to decay and break down. It's water activity. There's just more water in the fresh fruit and it allows the mold and bacteria to grow. If it's dry, it doesn't allow the mold and bacteria to grow. It's all about water activity.
Think of air as a sponge. Yep. You got a wet sponge trying to basically wipe up a wet area. It's not going to be able to because it's so saturated. Totally. Yep. How is dew point and humidity? How's that different? People talk about dew point, which has a correlation to humidity. How's that different?
Well, dew point doesn't usually come into conversation with mold as much. I mean, that's the point at which the temperature and the humidity levels achieve
100%, right?
Yeah, 100%, so that you get dew or water forming on the surface. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the idea being is there active water? Dew would be active water in high humidity where the material is essentially saturated. See, if you get the material above a water activity of, I guess, about 0.8, mold will start to grow. And when it gets up 0.9, 0.95, then it really takes off, especially some of the nastier species. And so keeping that water down, keep materials dry is absolutely the key.
Excellent. Let's talk about some of the more toxic species of mold. We have like the mycophenolic types, which are going to be more water-based. You have the black mold that you mentioned, the penicillium-based molds. And then we also have like the mycotoxins, which are toxins that come from the mold. So a lot of people, they're really having issues with a lot of the toxins that come from the mold, not just the mold. Can you kind of break down like, your top 5 or top 10, like chief list of the mold, and then kind of go into some of those really damning mycotoxins?
Sure. And that's really tricky because mycotoxins, last I saw the count was at right about 1,000 mycotoxins that are known.
That's crazy.
And then there's also the MVOCs, the microbial volatile organic compounds. So when the mold is starting to grow, it's putting off these MVOCs, which include alcohols, aldehydes, ketones, and they're volatile organic chemicals that people will react to and be sensitive to. And could make them sick. But then you get into the actual mycotoxins, in which small amounts of this chemical compound inside the body is toxic and creates toxic symptoms. And so when we look at the mycotoxins, well, everybody says, oh, Stachybotrys black mold has the worst toxins. Yeah, it has bad toxins. But I got to say that we see more people sick from exposure to Aspergillus species than from Stachybotrys, just because it's more common, it's more prevalent. And so, when you look at mold sickness, mold illness, or mold toxicity, it often is a matter of what you're being exposed to, and the most likely culprit more than what's the most toxic. Like Pithomyces produces some real nasty mycotoxins, but it's hardly ever discussed. As I said, Alternaria, it's actually the most antigenistic mold. It's the one that creates the real autoimmune type symptoms in people, but a lot of people don't even have it on their radar. So there's lots of little tricks to it.
Interesting. And I thought I had black mold. And I think when we tested it, I'll pull up my labs here in a minute, pre and post, and we'll talk about them, is I thought we had black mold. But I think when we ran into the lab, you guys said it was more Aspergillus than anything else.
And that's not uncommon for shorter-term water leaks. So you kind of have a growth sequence where you'll start, if there is a water leak, you get some Aspergillus, Penicillium growth, some Cladosporum. And if there's more water, the water persists for a longer time, then you start getting the more toxic species, maybe some Alternaria, and then some Chaetomium, and then eventually Stachybotrys. So that there is kind of a growth sequence based on the length of the leak and the severity of the leak.
So let's talk about, so the big one's Aspergillus, right? And then you have the black molds that you mentioned there. Is there anything else you wanted to highlight there? Just the big guns.
Yeah, well, in our reports, we detail the types of mold and the mycotoxins that are currently known with them. And I think you're nailing it there. Aspergillus, Penicillium, Chaetomium, Fusarium, Trichoderma, Stachybotrys, Pithomyces, Alternaria, if I didn't say that one. Those are the most common we see that are creating mold toxicity in people.
Let me go share my screen with you. Let's go take a look at this real fast. That way people can actually see what some of these labs look like, and they can see some of the mold that was actually in my house. And then we'll look at the pre and post on that. And then we'll go into what we can do about this, how to test it, how to assess it, what to do. I think this is really important. All right, let me share my screen here. Actually, I'll pull this up in just a few minutes. Give me a few minutes to get this all prepped up.
Sure.
But in general, with the labs that you guys are running, there's a couple of X factors on there. I want to talk about some of the X factors, which are going to be mold brought in from animals. How are you assessing or trying to, extract the mold from animals coming from the outdoor versus the mold from a water leak inside? How's that being done?
Well, that's a great question. And that's why what I say is 50% of what we do as a company is the laboratory analysis. The other 50% is on the consultation. So really, if somebody's going to send us samples, they really should request the consultation where one of our trained experts can look at this and give suggestions on potential problems. So if we see like Candida, Nocardia, sometimes Trichoderma, sometimes Microsporum, Rhodotorula, these genera of mold are often from people or pets rather than water damage. And so we can kind of look at it and say, hey, you have high Candida in this area. Do you have a person or pet in there that maybe has some type of yeast infection? Or if, the Cladosporum is fairly consistent across the board, say it's 2 colonies across the board. Well, that looks to be the normal background level for the house. Now, if you have high levels of Chaetomium, that shouldn't be anywhere. We shouldn't see that. And so that's a definite indication of some type of water damage. So we look at this based on the statistics, the number of samples collected, the prevalence of a certain genera of mold within the home, and then kind of make some recommendations there, along with the homeowner's knowledge of water events. So again, it's kind of an iterative process, trying to determine potential sources and make improvements in the environment.
Interesting. All right, let's go over what a panel looks like here. Let's go break this down. All right, so here's my panel here. Let me know if you can see my screen yet.
Yep, I can see it.
All right, cool. So here's my panel here from last February. And there was like a black mold sample essentially in the kitchen behind the stove. I think what happened is some of the caulking that kind of seals the countertop from the back of the wall, I think it kind of failed, and just water and moisture, whether it's from cooking or humidity on the stove or just spills on the countertop, went back behind, and mold was growing all up behind the stove or the range. And you could see here 19 in the air, a 19, and we'll go over what that looked like. And then everywhere else, basement, which I actually had a little bit of visible black mold on the 2x4s on the ceiling, the various joists. We'll talk about that too. And then master bedroom was pretty good. And let's kind of break down what we're seeing here on the analysis.
Sure. Well, just starting there, basement island, that's kind of a normal background count, right? You'd expect to see a little Aspergillus, a little Cladosporum. Those are most common in the environment. And Candida maybe come from people or pets.
Yep.
Kitchen island, of course, 19 is very high. With that, mucor is a mold that requires long-term water and quite a bit of it. And so when we see mucor, we're like, okay, there's been a severe leak for a long period of time. Of course, Penicillium grows, as Microsporum, Cladosporum. Those are common molds to show up if there is initial problem. Let me also point out there, you have bacteria These mold plates, we use a Sabrod dextrose auger that's intended to grow mold and inhibit bacterial growth. But if there is a tremendous amount of bacteria, it'll break through and grow. So we note that on the report because that's interesting on the overall biologic condition of that room. Whether the bacteria is good bacteria, bad bacteria, inert, we don't really know. It's just interesting to consider in the overall biologic load of that room.
Very good. And then the master bedroom, not too much there.
Nope. That'd be normal background.
Cool. And let me just talk about what I did based on your advice and your recommendations. And then I want to get a sense of just, you talk about some of the remediation process can create some of these metabolites that are actually even worse than the mold. And you mentioned that your daughter is very sensitive. I really want to go into that. So what I did based off of your advice is, number one, make sure the water leak is addressed. That's number one. That's the first thing we assessed and dialed in. Second, we looked at addressing the environment. The basement, though, didn't seem to be affected, but we still addressed it anyway, just for safekeeping. So we got the whole house dehumidifier kind of lined up there, made sure sub pumps were good. Number three, we topically addressed the mold, and we did it with 20% hydrogen peroxide and a negative air containment. So all areas that we could visibly see, we hit it with the 20% hydrogen peroxide. After that, we then used the CitraSafe solution to fog that tire area. We opened up behind the drywalls with the dry fog, which gets us about a 1 to 10 micron size. So it's very tiny. It can get in between the floorboards and such. That got all in that area. And we fogged the whole entire house, let it sit for 24 hours. So any of that solution, any mold that was agitated would come back down, hit it, and be neutralized. And then we came back in, and then we just really upgraded some of the air filters we had in the house. We upgraded to, and we'll talk about this, the Austin Air HealthMate Plus. I have a couple others that are really good, Air Doctor, as well as the, as was one other one that I have as well, the Molecule. So those are the big ones that we upgraded to. Thoughts on my remediation process? You helped guide me through that. Can you walk us through that in general?
Well, that is a perfect scenario. So if people can afford to do that, you're absolutely right. There's no sense in doing anything else until you stop the source of the moisture. Two is there's no substitute for source removal. Whatever the mold is growing on needs to be removed properly. And then once you do that, then that's 90% of the work. Then the last 10% is some type of filtration or dilution, where we're talking about the ERV systems bringing in air, the clean controlled air into the house, exhausting out bad air. Or if you're doing some type of filtration, whether it's just HEPA filtration or it's HEPA along with zeolites, activated charcoal, things like that. So that gets kind of into what I consider a maintenance strategy, where you're trying to keep the mold load within your house low.
That's very good. Now, one of the things I want to highlight, I'm going to just, so this is really cool. On the back page here, we have the Aspergillus. You talk about some of the species here. And here's the interesting thing, right? Aspergillus. And these are where a lot of the problems come, is all these potential mycotoxins that may be spit out from these molds. So Aspergillus, you can see some of the various mycotoxins. Candida more from the pets. And then you can see some of the microsporium here, and then well as the mucor, and then the penicillium, and then the associated mycotoxins with that. Anything you wanted to say about the analysis or how to interpret the back page of this?
Well, that's a lot of that's for two reasons. So one is, we work with a lot of doctors, and they have found that by us including pictures and a list of toxins, it increases patient compliance. So we know that improving environments improves health. How do you convince others of that? So a lot of this is information to try and increase compliance. The other side of it is that this is the current understanding, the current research. They're finding more and more toxins all the time. Quite honestly, I probably need to revisit these lists to see if we need to add additional mycotoxins. So it's useful information. Some of it can be correlated to like a urine mycotoxin type analysis, but urine mycotoxins only test for, maybe 12 of the top mycotoxins. So even that's, it's sometimes difficult to correlate.
Interesting. Very, very good. Love it. Love it. So a couple things on the remediation side here I wanted to highlight. Because and just to give people kind of a baseline of how much it cost me about $6,000 to have everything remediated. Wasn't too bad. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we used to feel like it cost other people that I know $50,000 to $100,000, which is insane, right? You'd have to remortgage your house to afford a lot of that. So with some of these newer techniques, with some of the fogging solution, what's your assessment on that, like compared to how it used to be in some of the older, more expensive methods?
Well, the fogging solution specifically we refer to as the BioBalance fogging solution because we've done the testing on it and we know that it's very effective, and we haven't had anybody report back that they've had some type of reaction to it. A lot of times people are just as sick from the chemicals that are used as the mold. So we've had severe reactions to Concorbium, Microban, even some to Benefact, which is supposed to be a natural thyme oil, I think it is, or
yes,
I'm trying to remember. But so, we work with what we know works. And so that's why a lot of times we refer to Citrus Safe or BioBalance, because they're products we've worked with over the last 20 years and know they work. Now, as far as their use, I consider it a polishing technique. I think it's fabulous in that it touches every little bit of air. It treats the mold, and it actually I call it flocculating. It drops the mold spores out of the air onto the horizontal surfaces where it can be easily cleaned. It does penetrate the wall spaces and ceiling spaces. So it's very effective. In those cases in which people can't remove the source, it buys them time too. So we have a lot of times people say, oh, fogging doesn't work, fogging this, fogging that. Well, imagine if you're in an apartment or condo or rental house, you're not able to do the remediation. What do? I mean, you just die. That's not practical.
Right.
So you have to make improvements. Improvements are air filtration. Improvements are fogging. Improvements are diluting by opening windows. These things that you can do to try and keep your total toxic load below your threshold.
Very good. And you mentioned the corncrobium, which is the major kind of method for spraying. And the people that I hired, they wanted to do that. They kind of had a paracetic acid / hydrogen peroxide blend at the 20% level, which you liked was acceptable because it didn't create a lot of those metabolites. They also had the corncrobium. So we just kind of negotiated, hey, let's keep the corncrobium out because of the metabolites. Can you talk about some of those metabolites? Can you talk about your personal history with your daughter? Because I think you said that she would react, I think, even more to the metabolites than the actual mold itself. Is that correct?
Well, not so much the metabolites as it was just the actual chemicals. So
the chemicals.
Okay. Yeah. So this is, my history with this starts 20 years ago, and my daughter's almost 18 now. And when she was about 5, we knew we had this mold problem, this temporary rental we had between houses. And I used a bunch of bleach one time, and man, she got the same symptoms from the bleach that she did from the mold. And for her, that was a 105-degree fever, flu-like symptoms that lasted 3 days, and they would reoccur every 2 weeks that when exposed to mold. She got the same symptoms exposed to bleach. Now, when we talk about the secondary chemicals, we're talking more like ozone. When ozone's very effective at treating mold, and I have no problem using it in crawl spaces and places like that. You certainly don't want to breathe it, and everybody kind of understands that. But it also can interact with the paints and the furnished goods that you have in the house and create these secondary chemicals that can be hazardous. What are they? Not sure. This is just kind of my understanding based on the research I've seen. So based on the inhalation hazard and potential for creating additional chemicals, ozone's not typically recommended for treatment, but it does work. Just like I had a guy call me the other day. He said, hey, we got a remediation company who wants to use chlorine dioxide gas in the house. Will that kill the mold? I said, yeah, absolutely. It'll kill the mold. Yeah, it'll probably kill you too, but it'll kill the mold. So there's a delicate balance between treating the environment and creating a bigger problem. And so we try and do those things that aren't going to do any harm.
That makes sense. So the secondary chemicals from the ozone works good, but the secondary chemicals can be a little bit more harmful. That makes sense.
Could be. Yeah. So use caution.
Now, one of the things, it's kind of an emotional thing. A lot of people, once they see mold in a spot, like for instance, with me in the kitchen, it's like, crap. They kind of feel the need. Should I knock down every piece of drywall to go dig for mold in this house? So it's this kind of assessment of like, oh my gosh, this is going to be so crazy, so expensive. So how do you handle the mindset of like, okay, here's mold right here. You can see it. How do you assess the rest of the house without creating a whole bunch of damage?
Well, that's kind of the $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's why we recommend the fogging, is because it's going to get those quarter-sized spots that are, every 20 feet or something you're never going to find without some type of destructive analysis. So, we have an inspection company here in New Mexico, and one of the ways to sample within a wall is to drill a little hole and do what we call a wall check, where you pull a spore trap cassette out of that wall. One is most wall space, ceiling space is contaminated. It's just going to be higher than breathable air. So don't let that air communicate. That's kind of rule number one. But when you're talking about testing, you test between two wall joists. Well, what about the next two? There's air restrictions. Are you sure that you actually got to represent a sample? And are you going to test between every single wall joist? You just practically can't do that. So that's why we try and use air samples and dust samples to best see what we're being exposed to.
Because it gets really pricey. So we have the fogging solution that we can kind of get throughout the whole entire crawl space or the whole entire back of the wall. Because once we've kind of opened up the wall, so to speak, we can really get a significant bit of fogging solution through that area. We can fog throughout the whole entire house. We can also bring it down to the HVAC and turn the fan on and let it go throughout the HVAC as well, correct?
Correct. Yeah. No, that's great for treating the HVAC system. Change out the filter, pump it through the HVAC system. It does a good job.
And what do you recommend in regards to the preventative side? Okay, hey, my house is good, or hey, I don't even have a problem, but maybe I want to use some of these solutions preventatively. What's your thought on that?
Well, Jeff over at BioBalance, he now has that home maintenance misting kit. I love that thing. It's like $195 for that little maintenance mister. And then, a bottle is like $45. And I can treat my entire house with one bottle, and it takes me about 15 minutes. So, I keep telling people, and it sounds like a joke, but it's not. I've got 6 kids and 2 dogs, and they're nasty.
Wow.
And so they bring stuff in, and so I can go through and treat my entire house and lower the biologic loading in my house. And I just do it periodically every 2-3 months. If I don't have a water event, I don't worry that much. I use my ERV system to bring fresh air in. I use my IAQ air and my Austin air to kind of filter the air, and my family's wonderfully healthy.
That's great. That's really, really good. Okay. So you give me a couple of other questions here that come up from that. So the Air Mister is a newer product I think I've seen. I have a couple of patients that have used it. Evan and I have talked about it. He uses it now. When would you use the fogger versus the Air Mister?
Oh, I think I'd probably fall back on letting Jeff kind of determine that, but the fogger does a much better job at penetrating. It's a much more thorough solution. So you may want to hot fog initially, or if you know you have a problem. And then the maintenance mister is just to keep the levels down low. I know the advantage of the maintenance mister, the maintenance misting solution, is you don't have to leave. You can use it and just be there, and it's not going to set off the fire alarms. It's not going to alert the neighbors. I mean, if I've hot fogged before a townhome, and the fog's penetrating to the adjacent homes, and that freaks people out. Use the maintenance mister. You don't have that problem. So dorm rooms, apartments, the maintenance mister,
easy way to do it.
Go.
Totally. That makes sense. Also, I think the dry fogger is going to have a smaller micron size. So if you're trying to penetrate certain areas when you actually know you have mold, then it makes sense to do it when you know it, and where the air one can be more of a maintenance thing, but you could still do it topically as well. Just, I think you get a little more penetration with the fogger, right?
Well, you do, but in the hot fogging, I mean, anytime you heat something, it activates it and it's more effective. That's why we use hot water, right? So the hot fogging solution is more effective.
Got it. Okay. Very cool. And I like the fact that you can be maybe in a part of a dorm room, a hotel, maybe even somewhere you're traveling, and you kind of see, oh, there's water stains on the ceiling. I could bring that little dry fogger mist, or that air fogger mist, and I could still take care of my little apartment, hotel room, or Airbnb. That's great. Let's talk about air filtration. You mentioned a couple of devices. You mentioned Austin Air, which I like. You mentioned the Air IQ. I have the Air Doctor as well as the Molecule. Can you talk about what people should look at? We already mentioned some brands. I'll put some links down below in the video, and we'll put some links down below to some of the products that we talked about, some of the air testing, as well as some of the citrus safe products. Can you talk about what we should be looking for in a good air filter?
Well, that's a little tricky, and everybody has their opinion. And I guarantee you, whatever I say now, somebody's going to disagree with, and some people are going to agree with me. Real simple. I mean, filtration, mechanical removal of the spores is best. And so anything that has a HEPA level filter is wonderful. You'll see all these marketing campaigns that say, well, a HEPA only removes 99.97% of 0.3 micron particles, but ultrafine particles are less than that. Well, yeah, but the ultrafine particles, it still probably has a 85% removal efficiency. That's great, but that's the way they sell these catalyst technologies that break down the spores or break down the toxins. So, you have air purification, which would be the traditional HEPA filters. Usually they'll have some zeolite or some activated charcoal too.
Yeah.
Then you got
the Austin Air.
Yeah, the Austin Air, the IQ Air, they both do. Then you have the technologies that actually will try and break down the toxins, and I put those more into like an air treatment category, and that would be like your molecule.
Yeah,
I believe the Air Oasis does it. There's a few that use those technologies.
and that's like the PET technology. It's the
Correct.
light that's actually breaking it down, correct?
Yeah, light with the catalyst, and it breaks it down. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. So we kind of talked about some of the air filtration. I've been liking the Austin Air just because of the fact that I don't have to change the filter for a long time. That's kind of one of the nicer facts of that one.
Yeah, I think I have 6 of them between my businesses and home. So yeah, I'm a fan of them as well. What I
That's
like
great.
about them, and this seems silly, but like the IQ Air has a real fancy digital display. The Austin Air has a little switch with like, it just goes 1, 2, or 3. I can set it and then pull the knob off, and then my kids can't turn it on and off. So that's why I like it.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is one of the good features, because a couple of the units I have, they have a light on. Even like, I think it's the Air Doctor has a little moon that goes on at night. It's like, well, I want it in sleep mode. I want any light, I don't want any light coming. So the nice thing about the Austin is the fact that there is no light. That's cool.
Yeah.
Anything else that we should be looking at regarding at-home devices outside of, okay, we have the air mister, we talked about that. It's kind of more of a one-off treatment, maybe every 6 months to a year, or if we're traveling. We have the air filter that can kind of be a routine maintenance thing. We have like a dehumidifier that we can run to keep humidity down. Anything else we should add to our report home? Should we have like a moisture meter? Are there any other tech that you'd recommend to assess what's happening?
Well, moisture meters are good if you have a suspect area that you think is wet. And so if you're saying, hey, this drywall here I think is wet, you can take a moisture meter and either stab the prongs into it, or some have RF technology where you just hold it up against it. The problem is that you've got to know that's wet. If you're looking at all the drywall in your house, if you don't suspect it's wet, you're not going to touch it with a moisture meter, every single little piece. So moisture meters can be helpful, but they're not an absolute solution. I know FLIR makes now an infrared camera that plugs into my phone, and I think I paid $400 for it. And $400 is a lot for most people, but when you consider my first infrared camera was $13,000, it's pretty cool that now I have a $400 device that I can quickly look and see if there's moisture. Yeah. So I like that a lot. So that's the tech side. I mean, I want to reemphasize too, just to make sure we understand that dilution is still the key. And if people aren't familiar with these ERV systems, the energy recovery ventilation systems, they're fabulous in that they take your inside air and exhaust it out and bring in outside air to your inside. And the path of the air kind of crosses so that you recover 80% of your energy. It's a fabulous way to get continuous ventilation of your house. And most areas can handle them. You would have to talk with an HVAC guy, because if you have real high humidity, you don't want to condense too much water in your house. But just keep in mind, dilution is key. A lot of other, professional biologists will talk about positive pressure of the house. That's wonderful if you're able to modify your HVAC system, or if you're putting in a new one. But there we're getting to where cost is getting kind of prohibitive.
That makes sense. What about people that have already done some of the fogging and they see an increase in the mold count on the plates on retest? This has happened to a couple of patients of mine. It's perplexing. I know we've been texting about it. What's happening there, and what can we do about that?
Well, there's never 100% answer. It's situation by situation. Basically, if the fog touches it, it treats it. I mean, it's pretty simple. So what are the conditions at which that didn't happen? Well, one may be that the mold source is external to the fog area. Say it's in a crawl space or attic space that didn't get adequately fogged. Then maybe that didn't get treated. Maybe the source got disturbed or dried. So we talked about mold traveling just like dust. Well, picture it moving like dust, and wet dust doesn't move. Dry dust moves very easy. If you picture mold like a dandelion and you blow across that dandelion, all that goes into the air. Very similar with mold. If you walked up to your drywall, say you had a wall that was mold contaminated on the inside, and you hit it with your fist once, well, it's going to put all those spores into that air in the wall space that then could enter into your breathable air. So there's lots of different potential problems there. I know I've worked with Jeff extensively. If there's a case where the fogging doesn't work, he works with the people to get them some free solution to help fix that problem. So
that's great. That's really good. So from an assessment standpoint, I have one patient that comes to mind who lives in a very tropical environment. So first thing is, all right, we're assessing humidity. It's like 75% humidity all the time. So we have a whole house dehumidifier. We also have air conditioning running, most of the time. We've looked at roofs. We looked at leaks. We're looking at the foundation, crawl spaces, make sure there's no mold in those areas. and then keep the humidity low, and then fog, and then retest. Is that kind of the recipe there?
That is the recipe. Yeah. It's not surprising when people take and add dehumidification, take a humidity from 75, 80% down to, 30, 40%, that all of a sudden the mold levels go up. That does occur fairly frequently. Also, when people modify the house, whatever they're doing to address it, sometimes they stir up more mold. A good example is, carpet is a horrible reservoir for mold that gets, resuspended into the air. So when you go to remove the carpet, of course, that can create a temporary situation, which levels are highly elevated because of the removal.
Makes sense. Now, you also highlighted the fact that mold can be stressed, and when mold gets stressed, more mold comes about, or more mold. Can you highlight the idea of stressing the mold? What does that mean?
Yeah, well, and this came from a mycologist that I worked with years ago, and I hate to repeat things in which I hadn't really seen too much data, but I think this is widely accepted in the industry, so we're going with it for now. When mold is stressed, it produces more toxins, and so that's usually in regards to competition. So if aspergillus is growing and the chaetomium comes in and produces more toxins to kind of ward off the aspergillus or the penicillium, and it takes over. I think that's more in regards with what we're talking as far as stress. Mold, of course, is trying to preserve itself. So it's creating toxins and releasing spores to promote its life. So anything that stresses it is adversely affecting us, I guess, in our health.
That makes sense. So anyone that's having these issues where mold levels are going up on retest, really make sure crawl spaces are good, really make sure attics, basements are good. Look and see if water is hanging around the foundation. I mean, if it is, I think you would see the mold levels higher in the basement though, right?
Typically, yes.
Typically you would.
Based on when you perform the sampling. And, part of what we're doing, this is an iterative process. We're trying to help you diagnose your house and do it as cost effectively as possible. I mean, you kind of alluded to this. I know certain remediators that walk into a house with a mold problem and they say, okay, I'll fix your problem for $100,000. That's just the blanket amount. And they do a great job fixing it. But who of us wants to spend $100,000 fixing a house when maybe we can improve our environment well enough for, $1,000?
Exactly. And if we're seeing mold in the basement, we've gotten a dehumidifier set up, but water is still on the foundation. Are we going to have to do a sub pump to really fix that issue at root cause to get that water away from the cement foundation?
Yes. You don't want any standing water against a foundation or basement walls. Yeah, that's always a bad idea.
So you need sub pump, dehumidifier, and then of course then fogging, good air filtration, and then we're pretty good.
Yeah, there are cases where French drains to divert the water away, gutter extensions, just real practical, easy things just to get water away. If you got a high water table and the water's just naturally sitting against the basement, concrete it in, get rid of the basement. And I say that tongue in cheek, but the idea being anything subgrade is not a good idea for anybody who is mold susceptible.
Now, this is a great thing that I see a lot of patients come to me with. They're looking at buying new houses. They're like, hey, my last house may have had some issues. I really want to look and assess what new house I can buy, but I also want to know if there's mold issues to begin with. And we know people may not disclose things all the time on their seller's disclosure. So a lot of my patients are bringing a couple of these plates and they're asking the realtor, hey, I need to put these in the house for an hour, and they'll go around and they'll plate the house. So one, I think it's a great idea is plate the house that, once you're down to your final two, plate the house. Want to get your take on that. What other things can people utilize when they go into a house for the first time to be mold detectors, so to speak, where they can pick up little signs or symptoms?
Well, I think the first, and if you're buying a house, you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. If hire a local inspector, somebody who's really good that looks at these things. And typically home inspectors are not mold inspectors. Home inspectors will often offer a mold service where they'll take a sample inside, a sample outside, and compare the two. That doesn't really give you a good snapshot of what's actually occurring in the home. So, spend the $300 to $500 to hire somebody local to go in with infrared cameras, collect samples, put their professional eyes on it, and give you recommendations. It's just a good practice. If you can't afford to do that, at least do the do-it-yourself test kit to see what's going on. Understand that the way we do it is the testing, the gravity plates we use is really the best indication of potential health effects. Most other mold testing doesn't really link to a health scale, so it is valuable information.
Got it. So easy things you could do is just, if it's a crawl space or an attic, you could put a or a basement, put a plate up there. And then you can also
Sure.
just look at general history of leaks and those kind of things. Look for stains on the ceiling, which,
Yep.
they can all be painted over. Most people will paint them over anyway. Would you look at cracks in the foundation, things like that too?
Yeah. Just consider, how can water move here? How can water infiltrate? Here in New Mexico, we have flat roofed houses, which are always a big red flag. And
Yep.
two is the stucco. And if you see a bunch of cracks in the stucco, well, clearly water can go through a crack. So that's a potential problem, what we would call a red flag.
Anything else, do's or don'ts, that typical remediators would do that you should probably modify, kind of like the concrobium or the other compounds that could create more secondary toxins? Any other do's or don'ts?
Well, I think the first key, especially with the remediator, is to make sure they understand a negative air containment. And I use that as a screening question. I tell people, ask them, hey, are you going to use a negative air containment? And if they say, what is that, or no, then they're a general contractor, not a mold remediator, and don't use them, because they're going to make the problem worse. After you get through that.
Can you highlight that though? What is a negative air containment for listeners?
Yeah. And quite honestly, just go to YouTube and type it in, because it's been used in the asbestos industry forever. And you can actually see visually. All it is plastic sheeting and then a machine with a HEPA filter that sucks the air out of that area that's going to be remediated and then discharges it outside. So it creates negative pressure so that when those mold spores are released, they don't travel into the rest of the house. They go through the filter and get filtered out.
Doesn't stir it up.
Doesn't stir it up, doesn't create a bigger problem. A lot of people try and do it themselves, or a general contractor. They start ripping out drywall, carrying it through the house, and then the whole house is contaminated, and becomes a much larger issue then.
Excellent. Very good. Anything else?
Yeah. Use things that aren't hazardous. So don't use a whole lot of the chemicals. Even some of these that they promote as being natural or salts, they still seem to create reactions. We do like hydrogen peroxide, because I really haven't had too many people react to it. A few people have told me they've heard of reactions, but I can't pinpoint why. So it's a pretty easy one. And then make sure that they're going to do a third-party verification after remediation is complete. Somebody that's going to come in and say, yeah, there's not any mold left. The job is complete.
Very good. So let me just summarize, and then you can correct me. First thing is, one, if there's a mold issue, is it visible? Two, where's the leak coming from? Assess the root cause of that leak. Three, is it an environmental moisture issue? That could be just one, water sitting up against the foundation. You'd want to fix that, or getting a whole house dehumidifier to bring the humidity down to that 50% kind of range. And then 4 would be using some kind of topical spray to hit any visible mold. That's where the hydrogen peroxide 20% would come in. 5, the fogging solution to get the whole house behind all the drywall and everything. Mm-hmm. And then 6, maybe a maintenance, kind of like that air misters, a maintenance kind of solution after that. And of course, assessing pre and post. Did I miss anything?
No, I think you got it. Just in maintenance, I would put the air filtration in there too.
Air filtration, correct. Yep.
And even real simple, people get a huge benefit by changing out their HVAC filter for a higher efficiency one. Even you go to Lowe's or Home Depot and get those filters that are rated for allergens and mold. That's a big improvement over the cheesy paper filters they usually put in.
Excellent. Well, is there anything, JW, you wanted to highlight here that we didn't address, like core questions that most people ask, or just really important clinical things the patient should be aware of?
Well, I think what I really like to emphasize is that improving your environment will improve your health. People understand you got to have clean food, you got to have clean water, and you got to have clean air. I mean, the air that you breathe is a huge potential source of contaminants getting into your body, or toxins getting into your body. And, by doing these things that we talk about to improve your environment from a mold standpoint, it improves it from every standpoint. I mean, by bringing in and ventilating and diluting out toxins, you're removing VOCs or chemicals that have accumulated in your environment. By doing filtration, you're removing particulate matter, whether it's flame retardant, Scotch guards, whatever it may be, from your air. All these things that we're talking about overall improve your environment and will improve your health.
Very good. And 2 questions for people that are in the chat here that are chiming in. Number 1, thoughts on UV lights and their effect at knocking down mold?
Well, UV lights are effective at killing mold if there's a long enough residence time. And so people will put a UV light in a duct and the air is traveling by it so fast that it won't be real effective. So then they'll put a UV light kind of close to the filter, so the mold spores get caught on the filter and then the UV light kills them. I'm not real sure what the benefit of that is, because the spores are already filtered out and you're just going to remove the filter. So I'm not a big fan of UV light. I don't see a huge effectiveness for it, but it does kill mold. It's just not the most effective way to go about it.
And what are the best essential oils for killing mold? I know the CitrusSafe uses a bunch of those. Just for the listeners, what are those oils?
Well, there's a lot of them. I'm not an oil expert, but I'll tell you the ones that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
Of course, tea tree oil does a great job. Grapefruit seed extract, the citrus seed extracts, lemon, lime, tangerine do real well. I've seen some data showing thieves oil does real well. And then oregano oil, but you smell like a sub shop, an Italian sub shop. So that's kind of a tough one. And those are the ones that I'm most familiar with.
And what are the big modifications? I know you mentioned one earlier, which I want you to highlight one last time. What are the easy, the more complex to the less complex modifications that people can make to their HVAC to make it more mold friendly?
Yeah. So number one is put a better filter in it. I mean, it's just easy. Yeah. If you can get, there's a MERV rating system. If you see that, a MERV 11 or greater is wonderful. I have a MERV 16 in my filter in my HVAC system, but mine was kind of designed for that. So filtration's number one. Two is keep it clean. I mean, certainly you can have your ducts swept, especially if they're hard ducts. You got to be careful on the flex ducts because you don't want to penetrate them. If they do that, then you want to make sure that the vacuum cleaner is outside of the house and that they're running the vacuum through a HEPA filter so you're not contaminating your house. So that would be the second. Keep your registers clean. I mean, if you look at a register on an HVAC system and it's black, it's dust, and dust contains mold, just as a general rule. So by reducing dust, you're always reducing mold. So those are the real simple things. Let me tell you something that was presented to me just a few weeks ago that I thought was brilliant. And it was somebody that wanted to treat their ducts, that they couldn't replace them and they were contaminated. And so they wanted to use the hydrogen peroxide. They soaked a Nerf ball with the peroxide and then used a string and pulled it through the ducts to actually treat the ducts. So you're getting kind of sophisticated there, but what a brilliant little solution to treat ducting.
Wow, that's amazing. And of course, you can do the CitrusSafe solution through that as well.
Sure. Yeah. You can just fog it. That's a simple way. You want to reduce the total buildup of dust, but the fogging is a great treatment.
And for people that don't have, they're renters or they're Airbnb people, right? Or you're in a hotel, easy thing is, at least if you can't do the fogging, you can at least do the air mister.
Yes. Yeah. I carry one with me every time I go to a hotel and I just miss my hotel room. Yeah. Cause I did the studies early on against the Pseudomonas aeruginosa, E. coli, and methicillin resistant staph. And the CitrusSafe solutions wiped them out. Even though they don't advertise that, they worked wonderfully.
Yeah. And you can at least keep the AC on, which does have a natural effect of reducing the humidity. So you could at least do that. And if you're somewhere long-term, you could at least get a portable dehumidifier, maybe one that links into a drain. So you don't have to worry about emptying it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay. Great. Is there anything else that's important that you want to highlight?
Man, I'll tell you, you just about sucked everything out of my brain. I don't think I have anything left.
This is great. I mean, I need these calls for patients because they have so many questions. So you've really lined everything up. And then again, for resources here, ImmunoLytics is going to be the place. They're my preferred mold lab company. And we used a lot of the CitrusSafe fogging solutions. And this new water mister is going to be a new one that I incorporate with patients. Any other places patients or people listening should be going?
I don't know. You and Evan do a great job on talking about these. Our website, let's see, citrusafe.com, biobalancenow.com, our website, great resources.
Can you repeat the URL for your site?
Yeah, immunolytics.com.
I'll put all the links below. Anyone listening and driving and are like, I can't write it all down. Don't worry. Links will be below. We'll also have a full transcription of the podcast. If you don't want to listen, you can read it. Anything else, JW?
Well, let me tell you, give us another month. We're really working with the company to improve our educational materials on our site, make it a lot easier. So give us a month and check it out. And I think you guys will be impressed with what we're working on.
Excellent. Well, JW, thank you so much for everything and being a great guest, and look forward to having you come back soon. You take care.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.